Adam has prepared a short list of some of the big losses in 2000 and 2021, especially as it relates to organized labor. So, Adam, I'll let you go ahead and take that away.
Sure. I want to start with Richard Trumka because I think that's the probably the biggest name folks may recall. Uh, Richard Trumka, he came up through the mine workers, UMWA, and he served as a president of the UMWA throughout the 80s and 90s. He was elevated to the Secretary General of the AFL-CIO back in, let's see here, in the mid 90s to up through 2009, actually. In 2009 is when he was elected as the president of the AFL-CIO, and he served in that capacity until he passed away earlier this year in 2021. And, was certainly one of the most prominent leaders in the labor movement in the United States. We back when he passed, we talked a little bit about his legacy, and we really drew a lot of inspiration from Connor Lewis and a piece he wrote on Strike Wave. And, when you're talking about a leader that elevated, oftentimes you're not really talking just about that person. You're talking about the context in which they were a leader and the accomplishments and defeats that happened under their term. So, there's certainly been a lot to occur throughout Trumka's leadership, including, expanded debates around police and the extent that police should be involved in unions and how that relates to AFL-CIO. Of course, the immigration debate, which has always been a huge factor inside the labor movement, and that has certainly, been a big controversy, a big issue throughout the last decade or so that Trumka was president of AFL-CIO. Can't say that the movement suddenly turned around under his leadership. You can't put that all on one leader, of course, but the declines that we've seen that we mentioned earlier, we are still very, very far from the peak of the labor movement, whether it's the militancy of the 30s or the huge share of the workforce that we had up through the 70s.
Right.
So a lot of those issues still persist, and now it's going to be interesting to see what happens next in this leadership transition. I know Liz Shuler is the president, I guess interim. Is that right? I've heard some discussions about Sarah Nelson, very prominent leader with the flight attendants, as a possible replacement or a possible new leader that could come in. So we'll see. Anytime you have someone who's been in charge for over a decade suddenly pass away, you're going to have some changes in the institution.
Right. Yeah, I mean the Liz Shuler and the people that have taken over, I there certainly isn't, to my mind, a marked, change in policy priorities or anything like that from the Trumka administration, but representationally it is pretty interesting. We've got the first female president of the National AFL-CIO and the first black secretary-treasurer of the AFL-CIO in Fred Redmond, so from the United Steelworkers. So that's not nothing, certainly, and it is while, of course, representation is not everything, it is important that our institutions and our organizations be representative of the people that we're supposed to represent, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's good.
Absolutely. A couple of others that I wanted to mention. One would be James Loewen. James Loewen was a historian and a sociologist and an author, and if you know any of his works, it's probably his most famous one, which is Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your Textbooks Got Wrong. It was a book that for me was very inspirational, something that resonated with me as a teenager, as just a history nerd, someone who was fascinated with it. As I grew older and started to see some things that were a little inconsistent between the facts and, what we're often led to believe in the media and just sort of public narrative. And Lowen really did a fantastic job. This book came out in the 90s, but what he did was really dissect some of the most prominent textbooks used in history classrooms across the country. And he looked at the bias there, and he looked at, what's left out in our histories, the bias in terms of, whose stories are told and whose aren't, and how you're supposed to feel about it. And despite what some folks in right-wing media would lead you to believe, there is no vast left-wing indoctrination network happening inside of our textbook publishers.
Right.
I can assure you that Pearson is interested in making a profit, not necessarily enlightening the next generation. So if you're interested in history at all, or just some of the debates around education and the bias that happens, can't recommend that enough. Lies My Teacher Told Me. He also did some work around historical markers. He traveled all over the country and looked at those, little square, rectangle historical markers you see from time to time, and looked at, how much BS is thrown in oftentimes with those markers. And of course, we've had a lot of debates in subsequent years around Confederate monuments and things like that. But highly recommend that. Big loss, James Lowen. And, interesting thing about him is that he actually wrote a history textbook himself in the, aftermath of Jim Crow, as schools were in the process of integration in Mississippi. He wrote a Mississippi history textbook. And surprise, surprise, it pissed off all the wrong people.
Right.
It got him in some court fights. So the man knew his history, and he also knew his textbooks, and played a big role in my development as a history person and an educator. Along those same lines, someone that I'm only recently pretty familiar with is Stanley Aronowitz. I'd had a couple of his books on my bookshelf for years, but it really wasn't until this year that I explored Stanley Aronowitz and who he was and what he was about. And he also passed away this year, 2021, was born in 1933. He was with us for a long time. He was a rank and file factory worker back in the 50s. And then got involved in various unions and campaigns throughout the 50s and 60s, and ultimately became kind of a scholar. One of these folks in the labor movement who's a scholar, he's an activist, an organizer. He's kind of done it all, been on all sides of it. And he most recently was up in New York University. He was given an award, the Working Class Life's Lifetime Achievement Award for the Center for Study of Working Class Life at Stony Brook University. So that's, there you go. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a testament to what he was about. And the most, I'm not sure if it's technically his last published work, but really his last big one. Is called The Death and Life of American Labor Towards a New Workers' Movement. It's something I'm in the middle of reading right now, and he takes a look at the big picture that we've sort of been alluding to today in this episode. The peak of labor, the decline of labor in the past 5 decades or so, and what that all means and what the future holds, and how do we rebuild this. He argues basically that movement is over, and what the stage we're in right now is building something new. And I think a lot like us on this show, he's someone who, despite being 100%, 110% diehard union, is also willing to engage in critique of unions as institutions, and where sometimes leaders and institutions fall short in terms of the goals we have as a broader movement and as a working class. So shout out Stanley Ronald. Rest in peace. Appreciate the work he did if you're interested in, if we haven't plugged enough people and authors and resources today, there's someone else to add to your list. A little closer to home, also want to mention Emmett Jamar, who passed away not too long ago here in 2021. Those of you on WZZA probably know him quite well, know him personally. You may have heard our tribute to him, so I won't go through all that again, but Emmett was a longtime activist, organizer, educator, elected official in Northwest Alabama. He was of that generation that helped defeat Jim Crow and build a educators movement here in the state of Alabama. So if you missed our discussion of Emmett that was a little more detailed, check it out on YouTube. Certainly a legend here in the local labor movement. To close, I think we'd be remiss not to mention the many folks we have lost throughout the past year as a result of COVID and as a result of, our system, including poverty and the lack of health care, incarceration. At least as of November, we have, it looks like, almost around 400,000 deaths reported this year due to COVID, which is more than what we experienced last year in the United States, about 385,000. So a lot of folks, including many of you listening, probably know someone who lost their life as a result of COVID or has been impacted in some way. And it's a shame that our government and our employers have just been so insufficient in rising to the crisis and meeting the needs of our humanity. So I want to send my best to all those who have lost loved ones, all those who are struggling as a result of COVID. And of course, as I mentioned, they're unsung and unreported every year are folks who are suffering and losing their lives as a result of our screwed up system and our screwed up economy. And people who are choosing between food and medicine, people who are having to live on the streets, people who are unjustly locked in cages and brutalized by state security forces. And they don't, of course that's not phrased that way. We only say it that way when it's other countries.
Right.
But anytime we end the year, it's a good time to reflect. So doing some reflection myself, reflecting on those we've lost, those titans of the labor movement, those everyday people like you and I struggling to make it in the world, and looking ahead to 2022 and how we can build a better world that is certainly possible, but only if we fight for it.
Yeah. Well, and the with the COVID deaths, it is certainly important to point out that it didn't have to be, this bad.
Right.
Countries with comparable wealth have half, the death rate that we had, and even countries with nowhere near the comparable wealth. I mean, like Honduras had a death per million rate of 1,000, and our death per million rate was 2,458 as of now.
That's roughly about how many people died on 9/11. If I'm remembering that right.
And
so
that's per million. That's per
right.
million. And there are so many other places that have, Norway has had 230 per million. 230, where we've had literally 10 times that. It's just, even India, where we saw a huge spike a while ago, it's their death per million rate is 344. So basically it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
And the same for the people that are lost to poverty and incarceration every year. I mean, poverty has never been so underscored as a choice as when we cut childhood poverty in half with the child tax credit. and now the Democrats are just deciding to let that go, or Joe Manchin specifically. He's deciding to double childhood poverty, but by not extending the child tax credit. That really underscores, that was a choice that people made to do the child tax credit, give families $300 per month for every child that they have. That was a choice that we made, and it cut child poverty in half. Think about how many people's lives were made better than that, and how many people's lives are going to be made worse than that once it expires in January, and we haven't done anything about it. And incarceration as well. I mean, our incarceration rates are off the charts, and the people that justify our incarceration rates, they'll say things like, soft on crime. But to believe that our society is made better by throwing people in cages for petty crimes is just not backed up by the data, and it's only justified by believing that American people, Alabamians, are somehow worse, like a fundamentally worse type of people than people in like China or or Norway or we're just worse people, and so we deserve to be locked up.
And sadly, I think there are folks who believe that, and there's certainly they believe it about certain types of people,
right?
And I'm sure they're willing to share that depending on who's around when they're having that conversation.
The attorneys of Maples, Tucker, and Jacobs are proud to represent working people in Alabama and across the Southeast. They have over 100 years of experience representing injured workers in workers' compensation, personal injury, and disability claims. Let their attorneys help you when you get injured on the job. You can find them at www.mtandj.com or 855-617-9333. Let Maples, Tucker, and Jacobs help you when you get injured on the job. Again, the website is www.mtandj.com or the phone number 855-617-9333. No representation is made that the quality of legal services is greater than the quality of legal services from other law firms.